Hello, this is Georgina Rose,
This is Mikey Laurier.
And I'm Marshall, the Witch of Southern Light.
and welcome to Magnolias and Magic. In this episode, we're going to be talking about religious trauma. So, if you've been in the community for any span of time, you're going to notice that a lot of people who enter the witch, occult, even broadly spiritual, or neo pagan spaces, there's a large percentage of those people who do come in with some form of religious trauma. Religious trauma can be caused by a wide variety of religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity, which is what we're probably going to focus the most on just because two of the people and our lovely guests were raised in Christianity, so that's what we're most experienced with, but it can occur in Buddhism, Hinduism, and even within paganism in and of itself. So I pulled up a medical explanation of what religious trauma is. So religious trauma is actually not in the DSM, but religious trauma syndrome is used in the psychological community. This is the list of sort of symptoms that typically come as a cause, but obviously it can look a whole wide variety of ways. Um, Confusing thoughts and reduced ability to think critically, negative beliefs about self, others, and the world, trouble making decisions, feelings of depression, anxiety, grief, anger, a sense of feeling lost, directionless, and alone, a lack of pleasure or interest in things you used to enjoy, a loss of community, feeling isolated or a sense that you do not belong in the community you're in, feeling behind the times of their cultural happenings, and many other symptoms of PTSD, including nightmares, flashbacks, association, emotional difficulty, etc. So that's from Restoration Counseling Seattle. So that's sort of our definition of what religious trauma is. Religious trauma comes in a wide variety of severity. There's some people who just feel those social pressures, some people who experience full blown like PTSD symptoms. I want to add this here. We are not medical professionals. We are occultists and pagans talking about our own experiences and what we've seen around us. If you have something that you need to get treatment for, we highly recommend getting treatment. We are very pro psychology on this podcast. We do recommend getting help, but we're going to get into all of that. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about what it is, where it comes from, how it can affect our community, how traumatized people interact with our community differently, how we can help those around us who may be struggling, how this can lead to a very toxic anti-Christian sentiment, um, and advice for what to do and how to make our space a better place so that we don't traumatize more people and we don't harm people who are currently dealing with trauma. And if you are someone who deals with religious trauma, because I'm sure there's going to be quite a few people listening to this who are, how to sort of help yourself and live a better life. So let's break into it.
Sounded like you were just describing a list of things that involved my entire teenage years.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about why it's common? Because we know a lot more of the what causes it, which we'll get into. But why do you think it's so common that we see a lot of people with religious trauma in pagan spaces? Because like I personally was raised without religion, not like raised to be an atheist. Just it was never mentioned. So I don't have quite the same perspective. I have much more of like an outsider's view versus the insider's view about why some of this comes up.
I mean, I have my thoughts about why you see a lot of religious trauma in occult spaces. I'm not sure about other places, but I think one of the really big reasons isn't actually necessarily anything to do with the occult. It's actually that they were drawn to the freedom, they were drawn to the separateness, the otherness, the mystery traditions of, because the one that they were raised in almost pretty much drove them away. I feel like, and this is me speaking from personal experience, I was very much ostracized in my church, and I think my mom really struggled trying to raise someone that she didn't understand quite know how to always connect with on many different levels. I was not even out yet at the age that I actually got into witchcraft, so it was almost easier for me to find a sense of community in Wicca at the time than it was to actually kind of face other facts of otherness that were part of who I was. And I found so much welcomeness in Wicca. I mean, I've told you guys before, I think my first books were like Silver Raven Wolf and Buckland, and they were extremely all-encompassing. They did not tell me that follow this religion or you'll burn in hell. They didn't tell me that I was wrong for having different feelings. They celebrated womanhood. They celebrated this goddess and God, of course, but for me, it was so male focused growing up, so patriarchal. So, you are a man, this is what is expected of you. You should not follow these things that you're doing. Um, I don't know, I had some of those experiences, and Wicca was just so welcoming, and it was just this big spiritual hug that I think I was really, really needing that I was not getting at the church.
Yeah, I think that's really common. I know that for a lot of LGBT people, that's a similar reason because there's so much focus on like the man is important, masculinity is important, gender roles are important if we're coming from the Christian perspective. And then because I started with Wicca too, and that was the first time that I'd seen a religion that had an equal or sometimes even more focus on the divine feminine as a thing to be celebrated and to be embraced by everybody, not just women, but men too. Embrace your feminine side. And as a queer person, as an AFAB person, that was very validating. So I can only imagine what it must have been like. Because, I have the Christian culture, but I did not grow up in Christianity. So I can only imagine how much more intensely that must have affected you growing up with religion.
Well, I was reading through. There's a thing called Religious News Service. They catalog and they compile. They're on Twitter, like a ton of articles about religions around the world, and it is actually statistically proven that paganism is the most LGBT affirming faith of all religions currently. In terms of like polling and studies, of course, like I don't know the nuances of how that study was conducted, but RNS said so, so that's probably true. I think in in general, because like even if we look at the etymology of the word pagan, which there's actually been a lot of discourse about recently, the original source of the word was used in the medieval Christian church to refer to the country folk in the outside who were refusing to give up their traditions and their heritage, and they were seen as weird, right? Like the term pagan was one of othering initially, and I think that that's a good thing because it represents that even like the OG pagans like were more accepting, they were more resistant to conforming to the status quo, and I think that holds true into paganism. Like in Wicca in particular, you see this the masculine and the feminine because you see that positive masculinity, that positive femininity, rather than those more toxic, severe, sides of them. It's much more, and I've quoted this on the show before. Aleister Crowley's paganism is wholesome because it embraces all the facets of life. It's much less restrictive because paganism sees everything as divine rather than giving you that codification of rules that come out of all the Abrahamic faiths.
I actually very much agree. I feel like my mom my mom really struggled because my dad was basically atheist. My mom was Episcopal. She was raised Episcopal by her parents, and her dad was a lax Orthodox Jew. So I mean, like we have this whole mixed lineage of backgrounds, and I feel like because she grew up this way with this belief system, she really counted on the spiritual advice of our priest. Uh, um, it's very interesting. I'm saying all this, and all these memories are like flooding back in my head about different times. And don't get me wrong, one of the things that comes through religious trauma that can be so traumatizing is all of the good times you actually had when you were in the church, because there were really wonderful, loving, amazing people there. But unfortunately, different parts of the establishment made it too toxic for me to stay. And I remember my mom struggling with this so hard. She actually was. It was easier for her to separate, stand back, and choose her son when I came out as gay than it was for her to do the same thing when I wanted to be a Wiccan. And it was one of those things that she got so much spiritual advice from our preacher at the time, who was trying to turn me away from the devil, turn me away from the satanic crap, turn me away and back to God, and you need to do the confirmation and everything. And then when I came out as gay and she went to him for advice too, it was again hellfire, damnation. You've got to change him. Let me help you sign up for this type of therapy. And she was, hold on, wait a second, that's not the type of loving advice I was expecting from you. He's my son. And my mom's a therapist, so she's very aware of the harm that conversion therapy and a lot of religious push to push the pray the gay away situation. She's very aware of that. And that was when she actually pulled back and started rethinking, this is the man who's been giving me spiritual advice for years. And it made her start to question a lot of the other decisions and the other systems in place and dogma about what should and shouldn't be. And she spent a lot of time, I don't think spiritually experimenting, but experimenting as a mother with me. And I'm so grateful that she did. But I mean, it was obviously enough to kind of push two people away in one family.
I'm glad that she was able to take those considerations and to step back, because a lot of it, like you're mentioning of the good times, reminds me of our cult episode. And there's a quote or something about how, when we talk about Jonestown in particular, because that's really really famous. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Everyone's like, how could this happen? How could 900 some people die? How could they all follow Jim Jones for so many years if it was so horrific? Because you're hearing about all the stories and all the bad things that happened there, the torture and the punishments and the white knights. And the big thing that all the survivors tell is that it wasn't always bad. There were so many good times. You had this community, this family, this home, these stories of laughter and joy that shared together with your community. And that makes it hard to leave, because you're usually leaving behind family if you're rejected, especially in more intense religious sects like Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. Sometimes you literally aren't allowed to speak to your family ever again. So you have to give up everyone and everything: jobs, homes, family, opportunities, everything, if you were to leave. And that definitely, like, that alone, that isolation that can make you feel, can cause immense amounts of trauma. But I think people forget that it's not all bad. There's not always going to be like every single day is a living nightmare, because there's still those good times.
Well, for Mormonism, I actually have an experience with that. So I've talked about this before. My family growing up, my mom and my dad were Episcopals, and my dad remarried, and he married a Mormon woman. And I remember I went to a Mormon wedding for one of the family members, and we went to the big temple in DC. I grew up in Appalachia, and we went because that was like the closest big like Mormon center. Because there was like a Mormon church near my town, but it was kind of far out, but it wasn't where they wanted to get married. And I love weddings. I always have. And I was a teenager, like early teens, I think. And I was really confused why I couldn't go into the building. Because, like, I could go into the regular Mormon church, but if you're not, like, a baptized Mormon, you cannot go in the building. I could not watch the wedding. I had to stand outside with my dad and my little brother. Because my step family could all go in, my stepmother could go in and all that. But, like, we just stood there, like, outside the whole time. And I
Well,
remember
even
being
if
so
you're a Mormon, you
confused.
can't necessarily go into temple. You can lose temple rights.
There's a lot of rules, and I was so confused because I was like, these people were always very, like, all the Mormons I've met are like very kind people, you know. There's almost even a little bit of toxic positivity, but that's a different conversation. But it was so odd. Like, there's definitely with Mormonism in particular like an isolation element um, with that, because you lose your ability to walk in to see your step grandmother's remarriage. Like, it was a very weird moment, and I don't have religious trauma personally, but I remember that moment being very odd. Um,
I remember having an experience once where I was refused communion. Um, it was at a wedding. It was a Catholic mass, and this was actually separate from everything. And I grew up going to Episcopal church, so I'm very
yeah,
aware of the diet Catholicness, the Catholic lightness.
if I remember correctly, I haven't been to an Episcopal church in years. They let you take communion if you're not an Episcopal, right? I think
Yes,
so.
they
I think
do. They
anyone
do.
can,
And
because
so
I've never seen someone returned away.
right, right. So I grew up that way, and so I was at this Catholic wedding, and I was just following the procedure. I waited in line. I put my hands out. They gave it to me. I went over to the wine. I saw some people dipping and some people sipping, and I wasn't sure which I should do. And so I stopped and I said, "Should I dip?" And she goes, "Are you even Catholic?" And I just went, "Well, no." And she like covered the cup with her hands, like she was gatekeeping Jesus's blood from the non-Catholic. And she was like, "Go sit down." Like it was a scene. It was in front of the entire congregation, and I just sat there with this little wafer in my hand, like, what am I supposed to do? What, should I eat it now? Should I put it in my pocket? Should I give it back? Like, it was very aggressive, and I had no idea that Catholicism really focused on, if you are not Catholic, you cannot consume the Eucharist. That was part of their belief system that I was unaware
Yeah,
of.
I didn't know that either, because you would expect that, well, in my mind, if you're being logical about it, my expectation would be everyone's allowed to take communion because everybody's allowed to partake of the body of Jesus Christ, and them turning you away would be like, that would make you think that Catholics are mean and bad and awful and rude and exclusive. Wouldn't the whole point be like, we'll let you take part in this and you can get more of the intake of the body of Jesus Christ if you become a Catholic and come to mass and you make Catholicism your thing? Like, wouldn't it make more sense to join?
Well, that's so
like to join
interesting.
in?
So weird because if you've been to like a pagan groups, pretty much the way that it'll work is they'll have, or at least for Thelema and the Wiccans in New York, I can only speak for the experience of the New York City occult community. Basically, the way it works is there are some groups that have these like open, there'll be open events that anyone can go to. You don't need to really be a pagan. But you can just go and attend. You can be curious, like you can just attend these rituals. And then if you want to take it more seriously, you go through initiation or go like you get into like the inner courts and then you go to like more advanced stuff, but anyone's allowed to go to the open things. Like that's how like Wiccan outer courts for instance work, and how various thelemic organizations tend to run, like Gnostic mass or an outer court ceremonies for everyone. And if you decide to initiate or enter these groups, then you go through some sort of degree structure or whatever, and it's just much more welcoming in that way. I've never seen someone like when you're doing libations be turned away from a glass of mead or something.
But I mean, like,
Yeah.
I have pretty thick skin. Imagine if that had been just someone who would have been more affected by that. Imagine if that had been someone younger. Imagine if that had been someone who just like me just didn't know any better, but it would sit with them. They would think like, "Oh, I'm never going to a Catholic mass again. Oh, is this the way all Catholics are?" You can see how just that small, publicly somewhat humiliating experience in the middle of a wedding. I mean, this wasn't just a mass. This was a wedding. Like the whole family on either side lined up in the front row to watch this whole thing go
Oh.
down. So, like I said, I have really thick skin. I'm okay with it, but it was a memory that stuck with me forever.
Well, I think that's what happens with a lot of people who enter our community with religious trauma, because a lot of the people entering the community now are pretty young, and pretty much everyone's coming in through solitary eclectic practices of various forms, right? A lot of people's first esoteric experience, which I wrote about in my Defend Occult Books essay for Patheos Pagan, is not by attending these groups, or going to a shop or something. It's through your experience through the internet or whatever. I think a lot of people who are getting into it have that religious trauma that so many people in our community have faced because they felt rejected by mainstream religion for various reasons. And a lot of people are very young. So they're going on to TikTok, Discord, Instagram, whatever, and they're interacting with people and they kind of get into these discussions where they start taking their personal trauma and sort of like bashing the entire religion. Because my view is this: you can critique parts of an idea without like hating everyone who subscribes to it. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between saying these things about Christianity to me, I oppose and I have issue with, without saying I hate all Christians. I think there's a big, big difference there. And I think because religious trauma is so intense and so painful, sometimes people, out of a pace of anger and suffering, lash out in that way. And that I understand. I don't think we should like, crucify, haha, these people, or like, call them out. I don't think that's the right thing to do because they're doing it from a place of trauma and suffering. But I think we should kindly try to like deal with them in a way more sensitive way. Because I see some people being like, if you bash anti-Christian, you're like a bad person. But I think most of this comes from trauma. And I think that's a thing we need to talk about as a community, because as we were mentioning before we started recording, like a lot of these Wiccan books from the 90s really kind of leaned into that angle.
I feel like that was actually one of the reasons that I know some people today look back at early Silver Ravenwolf books as being um, somewhat a little heavy on, I don't want to say Christian bashing, but somewhat down talking. And to be perfectly honest, from my memory serving me, it existed. I don't think it existed quite as bad as it sometimes gets made out to be in online spaces, but to me,
Yeah.
that actually is what I identified with. I identified with this woman writing directly to people who had experiences like this. And I think maybe reading something like To Write a Silver Broomstick, Teen Witch, or To Stir a Magic Cauldron now in 2021, we have a very different mindset about what's going on. So we can't always apply the same sort of thing because in the late 90s, when these books were written, they were written from a perspective of someone who actually was trying to speak to the reader who lived through that religious experience.
I think it leads sort of in two directions when it comes to dealing with the trauma of rejection. I I have a confession. So I mentioned sometimes that I was an atheist. Um, I was an anti-theist specifically for a long time because I didn't know enough about world religions, and I was so hurt by the rejection of being a queer person and being an AFAB person who is trying to live so fiercely independently and trying to be equal to all of my peers, I lashed out, and it was more anti-Christian specifically. I think it sort of goes in those directions where you're anti-Christian in one way or another, either in the pagan sense of my religion is better because it's not as shitty as yours, stupid Christians, or you become sort of an anti-theist where you're like Christianity stupid, organized religion bad, all religion bad. And we spoke about some of the anti-Abrahamicism that exists, and especially specifically anti-Christianity that exists in a lot of pagan spaces with J. Allen Cross. But it really does come up in that way of your abuse turning you into, and I don't think it's usually in a way that informs your ability to have power. I think it might be a slight stretch to call it abusing as a person who goes through that abuse religiously becoming an abuser themselves, but I think it's more like bullying. A lot of people start bullying Christian practitioners. I saw the sentiment for a while. I see it less now, at least in the spaces that we're in. I don't know about other spaces, but I know that when I first started joining Pagan Discord, we had to specifically have talks that were like, do not bash Christian witches. We accept all faiths in this server as long as you're being respectful. Do not bash the Christian witches, not to mention how much of folk magic is influenced by Christianity and how valid of practices those are. There's a lot of nuance to the conversation. A lot of people just go straight to blanket, I hate Christianity because Christianity hurt me.
Well, that almost threw me off of paganism. So when I got into the occult, I came in through, I've talked about it a little bit. I had like, I inadvertently invented Gnosticism, like the Gnostic demiurge, whatever. But I had a very Abrahamic framework of how I approached things. I was an Appalachian folk practitioner, and I thought about things in a very Abrahamic way because it was what I was exposed to. I knew a Wiccan girl who sort of opened my eyes a little bit, but I ended up with time moving into Thelema, which Thelema still actually has some Abrahamic influence and components to it. So, but that's a whole long conversation. But I remember like I interacted with like true neo-pagans for the first time because I wasn't really a neo-pagan. I was like in that weird middle zone of like Western occultism or whatever. And they were like really anti like Abrahamic or like, and I was very like confused by it. I found it kind of off-putting because I was like, I understand where this comes from and I actually sympathize with it, but it felt just very aggressive, you know? And this is the thing. I don't I don't have any resentment towards the people who do that because I see where it comes from, you know? I think the way to interact with people like that is to talk to them, you know, see where it comes from. I feel like we can't really fully blame them. But if you go from like internal resentment to, you know, lashing at other people, I think that's, you know, a bit toxic.
That's where you
But
cross the line because
yeah,
you were hurt by the church, by Christians, by organized religion, and then you're using that pain that you received to attack others who maybe didn't even attack you in the first place. Like the times that I did see some of this anti-Abrahamic, anti-Christian specifically sentiment, because um, anti-Judaism and anti-Islam is a whole different bag. But the no, but the anti-Christian sentiment is usually the most common, and the anti-Christian sentiment in particular, when I saw it happening, it was to people who were innocent. They were just like, "Yeah, I'm a Christian," and someone was like, "Christianity's stupid and dumb, and it's not even real anyway. Paganism's real, and you're stupid, and you're an abuser for being in Christianity." I was just like, "Whoa, what the fuck? Maybe
the
you
thing
need to calm down."
the thing that's so weird about that is people who are more Abrahamic occultists or like Christian witches and stuff, by the evangelical Protestant, not so much like a lot of these Christian sects actually see them as heretics or see them as like deviating from scripture. So like as like a Gnostic Appalachian folk, whatever I was doing when I was new, whatever I was doing, I was still seen as an outsider. I didn't relate to the Christian church, you know, like the Christian church didn't really like me either. A lot of these like Christian witches in particular get a lot of shit from other Christians. You know, I don't think we should add to that fire.
I think one of the things that I find really really interesting is that I personally was one of those people that had a deep sentiment of anti-Christianity because of my own experiences. But funny enough, the more I studied, the more that kind of started to blur a little bit. And to be perfectly honest, following you, Georgina, was one of the things that actually opened my mind up to more Abrahamicism with ceremonial magic, with Key of Solomon, with different types of rituals that completely opened up a door back into the world of Judaism, of Christianity. It it was kind of a push for me, to be perfectly honest, because of my personal background and feelings. And then I also met my co-host of my podcast, Southern Bramble, which is Banex Bramble on Instagram, and he does a lot of folk magic that involves using a charmer's psalter, which is all the psalms from the Bible. And the more I started learning, the more I started realizing that my journey into witchcraft and folk magic was also helping to heal my own religious trauma, because all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, it was very slow. I do not have that same aversion that I had several years ago. I don't have that same sense of recoil when someone tells me something or says something that I pursue or perceive as evangelical. Um, so it's interesting to think about that. Actually, paganism is helping me heal my own religious trauma.
I had a similar experience when I started diving, not terribly long ago, honestly, within the last year ish, when I really fully dived into Appalachian folk magic, Ozark folk magic, like a lot of the American stuff, and now with the powwow tradition stuff, the German American things. There's so much of that Christianity interwoven within it, and I really did have to get rid of some late. Like I thought I was good, and I realized I had to confront this like anti-Christian stuff because I was like, oh fuck, it like uses like I knew it was Christian based, but I was like, oh no, they use like the Bible, like they like it. You cannot separate Christianity from these practices because then you're not doing those practices. It's like that interwoven, and I had to confront some of that. And I didn't realize that I had. I don't know that I would call it trauma necessarily, but
Hang-ups.
biases, yeah, hang-ups, biases against it and against like certain religious things. And there's still certain parts that I do hold that I do have to work through. Some of it's like half and half, having hang-ups and biases, and half I just work better independently. But my push against covens for myself, I don't care if anybody else is in covens and organized groups. If you like them and they work for you, great. Just for me personally, I don't really have any plans to join a coven, to be part of a coven, to attend coven things. Like if I was going to be part of a group, it'd be more like a study group of equals, because I find for myself and my personal experience that organized religious groups tend to lead to problems really quickly, some of which we cover in like our cult episode. But just generally, like I still have some religious hang-ups, maybe not trauma, to deal with because of some of that, especially because of Christianity with, you know, some of the, I won't get into it, I won't even really name it, but the things coming out about the Catholic Church, not just in America but all over the world right now, that stuff runs deep, and it's a long history, and it's hard to work through, especially when so much of it, either for personal experiences or for community experiences. I mean, hell, for Ireland, the whole country, the home for unwed mothers or whatever it was, like those types of places, like for an entire country, it's like a giant trauma, and it's hard to work through some of those to be able to view the church as an institution versus the religion itself and the practitioners of that religion as nuanced creatures that are connected but technically separate.
There's this thing called deconstruction. I've been looking into some just out of curiosity. I started reading some like postmodern progressive Christian literature because I wanted to know how these like very progressive people reconciled some of the like harsher doctrine. And there's this idea they have called deconstruction, where you take your beliefs and you try to deconstruct your biases from the scripture and like break it down. It's for a lot of people who are like LGBT who are staying within Christianity. There's a really good YouTuber called God is Gray that has
I
explained
love God is Gray.
deconstruction in great length. But it's basically like a way to kind of figure out how it works for you and break down that trauma. I'd really recommend just looking up like Christian deconstruction, deconstructing spirituality and stuff. It's very good for like self help. It is aimed towards people staying within a Christian framework, but I think it can be applicable to people heading out. Because I think reading the way that like certain like I know a Catholic mystic who's like who's LGBT, who is proudly a Catholic mystic, and how they kind of deal with all that and process the spirituality as separate from the human component, and sort of the arguments they make, the ideas they share on like how to deconstruct the pain and the trauma from the ideology and from what matters most, which is the connection to the divine. Really interesting stuff. I just putting that in as an aside.
So what do you guys think? Because I don't have a lot of experience with this myself. How can we help people when it comes to struggling with the religious trauma that comes from, if we're in Western spaces, most likely, English speaking spaces, most likely is going to be the church of some form. How do we help people with that? Because it's uh, me having that lack of experience with the church and with having to work through it myself. I'm always sort of at a loss besides just recommending therapy, which will always be my number one if you've got any form of trauma, religious trauma or otherwise. Therapy's a wonder. But what do you guys think helps most for people who are struggling with that, whether or not they are being anti-Christian or not?
I think there are a lot of I think there are a lot of ways that one can heal when one realizes they're not alone. So, when you can find a type of support system or group, no matter what your means are, I know I'm not a huge advocate for a lot of different types of Facebook groups, but I do know that if Facebook is where you start, you can literally find religious trauma groups where people share their experiences. Um, I know there are actually different types of meetings. Like, I'm not going to say you can go to a specific type of like AA type style meeting, but I actually know of a lot of really, really open, non-denominational churches that are not there to preach at all. They're just there to be somewhat supportive. My mom took me to a therapist when I was a teenager that was connected to an LGBT supportive church, but had no affiliation. It was just on site. Um, there are a lot of resources in some of these things that really don't, and some of these places that don't preach. They're not trying to push God. They just want you to feel that you're not alone.
I know Unitarian Universalist churches are typically really good. I know some run this thing called the Cups Group, which is actually a very pagan adjacent sort of thing. So UU is a good thing to check out. In general, I think we should be kind to people who are dealing with trauma. I think we should be softer on them. And if you want someone to change perspectives and open up their mind to new ideas, you do that with kindness. You do that with education. You do that with extending your ideas to them, extending out your hand. You know what I mean? By just being like welcoming and making sure our faith does not do the same. I think our community, especially online, way more than in person, can get kind of toxic and stressful and you know polarized, and I think we should try to remember, like, for a lot of people we are their refuge. We are the faith that makes them heal, that brings them inner peace finally when they feel like they've been rejected from everything else. And so I think we should try to just make sure our spaces are that thing that people need, that people were seeking out when they read Ravenwolf in the 90s. And try our best to be kind to people in our community, because we don't want to inflict more trauma on others, because there have been people who have been traumatized by the pagan and occult community. Obviously, like, the satanic panic narratives are not true. That's all bullshit. That's complete crap. I want to put that out. But there are people who have had bad experiences for a variety of reasons. And I think we should work to make sure our spaces are safe and welcoming.
Oh yeah, because we're definitely not immune. I mean, I keep referencing the cults episode because so much of that information intertwines with this, where even in pagan spaces, there are I don't want to say that it's easy, but anytime that a power structure exists, there is a higher likelihood of power being abused, and this includes high priests and priestesses. This includes anybody who is leading any form of formal group. I mean, we see it even just on Discord. People with any amount of power in pagan spaces too. Like, we're definitely not immune. There are pagan cults that exist. They're far fewer, but they do exist. There are people in online spaces that are slightly more exclusive that use the dynamic of togetherness and family and like home and community, and use that as a way to get close to people in order to harm them. And it can be hard to try to face the thought of, I just got out of an organized religion, most likely Christianity, that had some of these culty elements, especially if you were in a more intense denomination. It can be hard to have to face that all again, because you could face that same sense of rejection and isolation, the same kinds of abuse that we won't get into, that can be traumatizing lifelong. To think that you've escaped that into something better, only to be confronting it yet again, to be facing the same kinds of trauma, I can only imagine how much that must compound together. So, I think that we sort of get ignorant thinking that not necessarily that we're better than, but that our groups can rise above that because we are different from, when in reality we're not all that different. And I really think it's important to stress that these dynamics aren't necessarily going to go away the second that you leave a different kind of organized religion for some form of pagan practice. So we still do need to be careful. And if you want to learn more about cult dynamics that play into a lot of this, listen to the cult episode. Otherwise, I would definitely recommend looking into the bite model, because I think that you should still check the bite model here and there for any kind of group that you join, even if you've been there for a while.
With Thelema, we definitely have problems. I don't like getting into Thelemic politics. I try to stay 10 miles away from them and not touch them with the stick because I don't want to get into all of it. There's a lot, but we've had some issues in our community with a variety of things, but we've definitely had problems in our groups. There's definitely a level of elitism you see in Thelema a lot. Because a lot of these Thelemic groups are hierarchical, they have a degree structure built in. That comes with problems. I think degree structures, I have a lot of thoughts about them, but in Thelema and also Wicca has the same type of thing, and so does Golden Dawn style traditions, but that can create problems. And I think if you're going to work within the confines of a degree structure, because Thelema is not bound to it, I want to point this out, you really need to not be an elitist dick about it, because that level of organization and that level of hierarchy for someone seeking this, because Thelema is a very opening, accepting faith. You know, if you go from a solitary Thelemite to one in one of these groups, it can cause some weird like disconnects and stuff. So I think we should try also to not, you know, like tear apart new practitioners. Like I've seen online where Thelemites will see some like clearly person who's been a Thelemite for like 2 months and they're posting like, I just read Liber 777. And then some Thelema bro rose up in the comments and is like, well, the attribution of this to this is actually wrong. And it's just fucking insufferable. Like gatekeeping has a little bit of a place in terms of like, let's not give flying ornaments to the 13-year-olds, but um
Definitely.
let's not be hyper elitist, because that can really turn people off, and we don't want to turn people off of the spirituality that helped us, you know.
And a lot of those places where people are just kind of sharing, especially newer things, like that's such a celebratory thing. Like to read Liber 77, I'm sitting here like I read it. I haven't read it. But I mean, like, obviously I feel like that's something that this person then read and felt great joy about expressing and sharing with the world in what was supposed to be a supportive environment. And to be perfectly honest, if someone just comes back and does like, well, actually, or whatnot, unless you're being truly helpful, unless that's coming from a place of like, actually, I have something that you should go next, or here's some good advice too. What are you doing in that space in the first place, except for just to brag and give yourself an ego boost?
Oh, it is, it's giving yourself an ass pat, you
Yeah.
know. It's not to help. It's like, if you wanted to correct someone, like, that's fine, but don't, like, you know, I just hate it when it happens to new people, because it happens the most to women, I've noticed. Like, it happens a lot to young female Thelemites.
I have a similar story. It's not quite the same because it's not like religious groups or whatever, but oh my god, I've been doing my LARP stuff for a long time, and for those of you who don't know, I describe it more like a sport because it does take actual skill, and you have to actually like hit the person. So if they block your shot, it sucks to suck. Be better, train harder. I've been playing since the end of high school, so 7 or 8 years now, about 8 years. And I will still get guys trying to teach me how to fight. I've been fighting that entire time. Like, I'm not a bad fighter. I've been doing this, going hardcore for a long time, and I can hold my own against the really good fighters. And I have guys that are in for like 6 months trying to be like, "Hey, do you want me to show you how to fight here? Okay, so here's how you hold your sword." And I'm just like, are you serious? You didn't even think to ask. And it's the same in religious groups. Like it's absolutely being an AFAB person. It's just dudes who think that you're a dumb woman. So I must show you, dumb woman, how to be less of a dumb woman. I, smart man, brains are stored in the balls. Like,
And that's the same patriarchal stuff that drives
yes.
so many people away from Christianity, like, and other Abrahamic faiths. All the Abrahamic faiths, you're getting called out. But
I mean, a
like,
lot of world religions generally have a lot more of that, like, man good, woman stupid
well,
thing.
that's why so many women, like the goddess movement, you know, like the reason why the spiral dance became such an occult classic is because a lot of women felt that they were reduced to being a baby factory, you know? They were really bothered by this essentialization of traditionalism in a way that for some people that really works, but it was pushed on a lot of women who did not feel connected to it. And so that's why they came to paganism. That's why, like, a lot of women who come to Thelema do it because they're like, no, I'm the one with the will. I'm girt with the sword. I'm willful. I'm strong. I want to join this religion that celebrates will, strength, valor, that intensity, that passion. You know, those are very much Thelemic virtues because Thelema is a lot about being willful, strong, embodying yourself, taking power. You know, um, and so a lot of women are drawn to that, and then they get the same patriarchal stuff because, interestingly enough, just because you adopt a pagan theology and a pagan cosmology doesn't mean these deep set cultural norms are not still ingrained in you. You
Oh
know, that
yeah.
stuff's still in you. Like, cultural Christianity is a complete thing.
Well, I see a lot of the culture of Christianity coming up in the way that people approach other religions, like the Odinist movement, specifically in Norse paganism, and it's not just specifically the Norse pagan groups. You see this a lot in other, like Hellenic polytheism as well, where they sort of pick one single god to focus on. All the rest get left behind. They don't touch those other gods at all. They pick one. Usually, like in terms of the Odinist stuff, it's because there's similarities of being like the top god kind of thing. So they choose this pagan god and basically just substitute Yahweh for, in this case, like Odin. And it's they culturally go about this pagan religion in a Christian way, and it's fascinating to watch, especially as somebody who, like, didn't grow up with that religion stuff. So for me, it's a lot more of I find it easier to navigate those spaces without running into that thought. But the way they approach worshiping their gods, the way that they think that gods will punish them, and it goes into a little bit with our mythological literalism episode that just came out last week. But like, if you light the wrong incense, this god will punish you, or if you say the wrong thing, this god will punish you, and you'll spend eternity in some bad place. And most pagan religions don't even have that same concept of hell. It's very much the Christian ideas but applied to pagan gods.
Yeah, you're not going to Helema. Helema is not happening.
And see, I'm grateful for you sharing all of this with me because, for one, I think sexism is dumb. Sexism is just straight up dumb. Like that's it truly is because growing up, all of my friends were girls. All of the teachers that I wanted to have a girl teacher. I mean, I'm speaking out like I'm a child because that was my childlike perspective. If I got a boy
Oh.
teacher, a boy doctor, a boy leader in something, I was like, no, ew. I want the girl. I want the girl teacher. I want the girl doctor. Like, that was the thing that I was drawn to. And I don't know if it was because I was a very effeminate boy and I was connected to my femininity, or my aunt called me Mama Sweet Boy. And I feel like it was one of the things that was so tough for me within Christianity was how man led it was, how everything was God was he, how even the Messiah was a male. And even there's a lot of different lore about, Jesus actually having possible marital relations, or whether or not there were women involved and as disciples. And they're so pushed to the outer edges of those storylines, except for, of course, finding his tomb. But at the same time, because of the way that that was all kind of built together, when I moved over to Wicca, when I found paganism, it was just such a I don't want to say female dominated space, but I mean, yeah, statistically it is a female dominated space. And I finally felt at home. I felt like I was with my friends again. So to now be in my 30s and listening about how that's so different from my experience, because the idea of men coming into a space that I entered being so female dominant and trying to talk down, like, ugh, what a load of horse shit. That's dumb.
Yeah. We have the opposite thing with Thelema. Thelema's very male dominated. Not like we worship men or anything or it's patriarchal, but just the amount of, like, the ratio. There's a lot more men in Thelema than women. I have some theories as to why this is a thing. I have my own ideas just because I think some of the philosophy, not saying the philosophy is masculine, but there's this level of, like, the aggression the aggression of some of the writing and, like, the focus on will and stuff, I think does appeal to masculinity in a lot of ways. I think there's this appeal to masculinity in Thelema. So I think that's why we're so male heavy, but women are still lifted up in the Thelemic like doctrine and practices. I mean, the Thelemic spirit that everyone cares the most about is a bad bitch goddess Babylon.
Yeah, it's really strange, and it depends on the space you're in, honestly, because and this is just from my experience with a very limited view. I don't know any of the statistics for Kemetic groups because I just don't have as much experience there, and it's a less popular pantheon, and I hate to put it that way, but that's just how it is. The Hellenic community is far and away AFAB dominant, like it's femme dominant for sure, and Norse paganism is a little closer to 50-50, which is nice, but I mean it's also generally male dominated because there's that focus on like brosatru and Viking metal, and that's sort of the aesthetic that gets people into it. But there are still a fair amount of women in that space, but I don't really see a lot of men in the Hellenic space, so it really just sort of depends on where you're going and what these dynamics are going to be.
My final thoughts are that you are not your trauma. You are more than the experiences that happen to you, and you do not need to let them rule your life. Trauma is super hard to break through. It's a painful cycle, and a lot of these things like isolation, rejection, can feel super fucking personal because they are. You know, in a lot of ways, people get personally attacked, and their family they have strife with, because a lot of the religious trauma does tend to go along with family issues. And so I think the trauma is just so hard to, overcome. Like, I was never religiously traumatized. I never had a bad experience with the church. But even as I got deeper into my practice, I had this residual fear of hell. Like, I remember I was laying in bed one night and I had this like invasive thought about like, what if they're right? What if I'm wrong and I, go to hell? And so I think like anytime you go into another faith, you have a lot to unlearn. I know you don't really convert to pagan, as the word conversion is very little used because we don't have like some big like you don't have your confirmation or whatever. I mean, technically you can get very similar rituals, and I'm speaking generally. I think the conversion is the mental framework shift, and I think it takes years and years. We've had so many people on this podcast who have talked about that residual philosophy, those residual hangups, those fears that nag at your core, and you don't even really recognize them. You're just sometimes doing a ritual and you get that invasive thought, and you're like, holy shit. Like, even if you don't have full blown religious trauma, even if you weren't a LGBT person who was rejected from your church and kicked out by your parents and sent to conversion therapy and all those like terrible horror stories that disgustingly happen more often than they should, those fears are in so many people's minds, even people who aren't even Christian, who just grew up in the culture. Like, our culture impacts our thoughts, our minds on a level that we don't even fully understand. Unlearning that is fucking hard. It's a lot easier to go full, bash all Christians, all Christianity's bad, haha, sky daddy, than to, seek, therapy, help, journaling, shadow work, all the things that are accessible to you. Obviously, therapy can be hard to access, but there's a lot of tools and articles about how to process trauma and how to deal with religious trauma syndrome. It's just hard, and I think you shouldn't expect it to go away instantly. Even if you can look yourself hard in the mirror and admit, yeah, I think I do have religious trauma. Yeah, I think I do need to get help. Like, learning this stuff takes years and sometimes even decades. You don't need to beat it overnight. And I think just genuinely wanting to improve, wanting to learn, wanting to be more open minded is really going to be what serves you best. Make sure to put your physical safety above anything else when you're looking for help.
My final thoughts are it can be really hard to approach these spaces when you come in with religious trauma, or if you're somebody in my position, seeing somebody come in with this religious trauma and watching it manifest in the community. And it may feel very difficult to try to address because, as a queer person, as an AFAB person, I definitely understand the rebellion against the church to that degree because I did it. I did do it. Granted, I was like 13 because I had a very different experience, but it's very deeply ingrained and it's hard to address. And I think honestly we shouldn't be trying as a community directly to try to solve it necessarily. We can be there for people to support them and to help them through with our experiences and to talk together. But I think ultimately it's our responsibility as a community to suggest that people go get a formal professional help, because some of these problems are larger than just this religion made me feel othered, this religion made me feel awful and isolated and alone. There's so much more to it. And as much as we want to help, sometimes for the outsiders, the hardest part is admitting we don't have the skills to help this person who is so clearly in need. And the best thing we can do is to get them resources, even if it's just helping them to find groups to be able to talk about this. We're not therapists. Most of us in this community are not going to be therapists. We're not going to be professionals. So do your best to help, be a kind, compassionate person, and try to have patience for people who are going through that anti-Christian phase. But know that it's not your full responsibility to take care of their mental health for them. You can support them, you can love them, but don't drown yourself trying to rescue somebody else from the water.
My final thought is actually a memory that's been coming in my mind within this whole discussion, and part of the process of going through confirmation, which I was kind of halfway doing, halfway being forced to do. We had to take all these classes, and I remember going to these classes every weekend and asking all these questions and getting confused and pointing out different parts of the Bible that I felt were contradictions. And finally, uh, the priest pulled me aside and he walked me outside the door and he says, "I need you to stop asking questions in class. You are confusing the other kids, and they don't need to be hearing this type of thing while they're preparing to make a lifetime commitment." And I'm thinking in my mind, aren't I prepared to make this lifetime commitment too? Isn't that what I'm doing here? And it was one of those aha moments. Um, so for me, what that really taught me was, one, never stop asking questions. You have so much to learn, to unlearn. There are so many opportunities to figure out who you are for the rest of your life. It does not have to be at age 13. It doesn't have to be at 16. It doesn't have to be at 21. It doesn't have to be at 35. We have so long to follow our spirituality, and it doesn't need to include bullying. It doesn't need to include spirituality should never need to include trauma. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, it has, and there's time and opportunity to unlearn that with a lot of these amazing resources that you guys have kind of brought here today. I know if you check the link tree in my bio at the very bottom, I have a couple links for what shadow work is and a whole list of prompts to work with that. And just know you're not alone. There are so many of us out there, and we're living through it and we're thriving from it. So that's my final thought.
I want to do patrons first. We always do yours and then patrons. I'm jumping in. Patrons first. Patrons. I'm going in reverse order this time too. We missed you last week because we had all sorts of technical difficulties. I'm sorry about the clicking. I truly am. So patrons, we love you. And if you do $10 or more, we get to read out your name and make you feel very special, because you are very special, because we love you. So in reverse order, we love you and thank you. Amy Monster, Barry, Evan, Jay, I see you, Janine, Jonah, Witch of the Rising Stones, Mooper. I know who you are now, so I can just call you Mooper. Corey, Doitsu, Dungreed Pagan, Jessica, Kat, Lee, Lisa, Marshall. I mean, you're here. Hello, thank you, Marshall.
Oh, you're welcome.
Megan,
Thank you for supporting the show.
Mike, Nauseated, Neon, Nico, Nicole, Ree, Rinny. We got a couple new ones. Rose and Victoria. Thank you guys so much.
And if you want to support Magnolias and Magic, we have a Patreon. You get extended shows, pre-shows, video versions, and everything, as well as extra episodes every Sabbath that we remember. So you get all sorts of extra things. If you want to find me, I am Georgina Rose. I also go by D.Darling, D-A-A-T, not like the fabric. Please do not look up D-O-T. It's a Kabbalah reference. Anyways, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and I have a personal Patreon. I do ritual guides, exclusive videos on more advanced or topics that I generally don't feel comfortable just putting on YouTube. So yeah, Georgina Rose Uncensored is my Patreon. So all that. I also do tarot readings and stuff. DM me on Instagram or Twitter and we'll set something up. Yeah.
I'm Nike. You can find me at Warrior Witch Nike pretty much everywhere. Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. I do Twitch. Me and Georgina stream together on Mondays and Tuesdays most weeks. Sometimes we miss some days, and that's okay. Pretty much everywhere, every social media. If you look up Warrior Witch Nike, you can probably find me. I'm pretty cool, and we have a good time.
And I'm Marshall, the Witch of Southern Light, on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube. I do also have a Patreon for anyone who wants to get more one on one advice and tips and tricks. I don't just give it all away, but I do have a Discord with the second and third tier. And if you're on the third tier, I will make you a personalized sigil of anything you want whenever you want. I'm also on Twitter at MarshallWSL. And soon, hopefully, I'll be back on my Etsy shop soon. But I've taken a little break from that.
Oh,
Eh,
and for I was gonna say OWAS, we're not OWAS anymore. For Magnolias and Magic, if you want to find us, we have if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can find us on YouTube as well. And we have a Discord server that should be. I take care of the descriptions usually, so that should be in the descriptions. We'll make sure that the Discord link is in there. But we have a super cool community, and we should plug it more because our people are cool, and we'll make sure we have the link for you guys.
Oh,
uh,
oh, and I forgot one more thing.
Yeah.
I
yes.
really need to say it too. I have a podcast. Me and my co
Yes.
me,
Yes.
me,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
is me. Oh my gosh, me and my co-host Austin of Banex Bramble on Instagram. We have a podcast called Southern Bramble, a podcast of crooked ways. You can listen to it on Apple, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, Anchor, and several others. So give us a try.
You should get
It's
on
good.
YouTube as well.
I should.
I
I need
listened
to do
to it.
that.
It was good.
Oh, thank
And
you.
this has been Magnolias and Magic.